When Russia invaded Ukraine and failed to achieve most of its military goals, a lot of people asked if they would resort to nukes. We all remember President Vladimir Putin's "I'm not bluffing" remarks, which many believe were veiled nuclear threats.
Это не блеф.
Of course, he hasn't used nukes, and Ukrainians believe that he was bluffing. So much so, they joked about it.
Ukrainians once again resorted to humor, and as you probably know, there are a lot of memes going around the social media about the war and everything related to it. Ukrainians are quite creative with their humor related to the war. So they created a paradoxical ridicule of nuclear war. On one of the Kyiv Telegram messenger communities, it was proposed to hold an orgy on Shikavitsa, which is an area in Kyiv, in case of a nuclear strike.
But none of this means the world hasn't been taking Putin's nuclear saber rattling seriously. Over the course of more than a year, he suspended Russia's participation in New START, announced the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, and reportedly put his nuclear arsenal on high alert. This has caused the West to be very calculating and cautious in how much military aid it sends to Ukraine for fear Putin will respond with a nuclear strike. These threats and years of advocacy from nuclear nonproliferation activists have renewed calls for an all-out ban on nuclear weapons and for all countries to sign on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or simply TPNW. It's a legally binding document that prohibits state parties from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, acquiring, possessing, or stockpiling nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Its goal is complete elimination of nuclear weapons. There are 93 signatories and 69 state parties to the treaty. Russia and the US, like all other nuclear states, refused to sign the treaty, and much has been written about why they refused to do so. But what about Ukraine, a non-nuclear state that's the very target of Russia's nuclear threats? We know what Westerners and others think about abolishing nuclear weapons, but we know very little about Kyiv's perspective. So, we asked 3 Ukrainian nuclear weapons experts how Ukraine views nuclear deterrence and why the country hasn't signed on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So, let's get to the basics. What exactly is nuclear deterrence?
So in general, nuclear deterrence is understood as a theory and also a set of practices that characterize the relationship between 2 nuclear armed powers. And the idea is that because of the credible threat of retaliation, both sides would be deterred, would be prevented from using nuclear weapons against each other. Right? That's kind of the classic understanding of nuclear deterrence, where the idea is not to use the weapons in fighting and winning wars, but to use these nuclear weapons in preventing a war, at least a nuclear war, from happening.
In short, I have nukes and I can kill you. You have nukes and you can kill me. So theoretically, it keeps your enemies honest. In the case of Ukraine, one expert argues if the country had nukes, Russia likely wouldn't have invaded.
Today, actually, there are 2 dimensions of this. First dimension is the fact that Ukraine has given up nuclear weapons in 1990s. And as a result, now the biggest nuclear state in the world is attacking its territory and taking its citizens and every day performing acts of war against Ukraine. And of course, there are certain sentiments in the Ukrainian public that now we understand the price of nuclear deterrence theoretically. And now we see that probably if we could have nuclear weapons, then we would never be attacked. On the other hand, the other situation is that Russia, with the power of nuclear deterrence, not only deterring NATO from interfering in the conflict and defending Ukraine physically, directly, not only with the power of arms, but also to a certain extent deter the Western supplies of arms, because West is not supplying everything, which is good for Ukraine to win. And also Russia is actually using nuclear deterrence as an umbrella to perform its aggression in Ukraine, against Ukraine in the neighboring states. So this is what it means for Ukrainian public.
After the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine possessed one of the biggest stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world. But Russia and Western powers pressured Ukraine into giving them up for a wide range of reasons, including Washington's desire to build better relations with Moscow's new post-Soviet leadership and a fear that Ukraine would be unable to protect and maintain its arsenal. Under the now highly criticized 1994 Budapest Memorandum, Kyiv gave up its stockpile to Moscow under the belief it would be granted military protection by the West if Russia threatened its sovereignty. The invasions of 2014 and 2022, however, proved that that would not be the case.
Well, let's admit it, we all see that it was a bad deal. No matter whether we support nuclear deterrence or whether we support complete nuclear disarmament, the situation on the ground shows that it did not reach what it was intended to reach.
There are many critiques of how Ukrainian leadership handled nuclear weapons negotiations. However, Kyiv wasn't in the best position to negotiate for itself at the time.
Honestly, no one wanted to commit to anything at that point. Ukraine was not perceived as an important player. It was in no one's interest to have more nuclear states. For the US at that point, if Ukraine was a nuclear state, it would have been a nuclear ally of Russia. So Ukraine was strong-armed to give nuclear weapons from both sides. And obviously, Ukrainian political leadership at that time was not fully used to making independent decisions. Since the country was newly formed, diplomacy was not so well developed for the same reasons, and best professionals at that moment were in the Soviet center, Moscow. Besides, pro-Ukrainian intelligentsia that could shape the government and the country differently was systematically annihilated through political persecution, arrests, and exiles in the Soviet Union.
In effect, one could argue that the United States and Russia took advantage of Ukraine for its own foreign policy aims, leaving Kyiv vulnerable to future Russian aggression. Think about it. The Budapest Memorandum doesn't contain any security guarantees, explicit or implicit, and was written to avoid such language because it would have needed US Senate approval, which likely wouldn't have happened. There are also plenty of arguments that Kyiv wouldn't have been able to maintain the arsenal because it was too expensive and they didn't have the means to maintain it. But none of this satisfies Ukrainians who feel they were never given the chance to know for sure if they could have maintained the leftover arsenal. Last summer, President Volodymyr Zelensky appeared on video with his senior aides posing with his country's application to join NATO. At the time, it was viewed as a publicity stunt. Russia occupies a lot of Ukrainian territory, and many Western analysts didn't believe its military could hold up. Now, more than a year later, not only is Ukraine's army fighting effectively against Russian troops, NATO has signaled that Ukraine will be a member of the alliance someday. This is where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes in, and why Ukraine hasn't and likely won't sign it.
Before the war and before the invasion, official Ukrainian government has been quite careful in the way it kind of sided with, say, the supporters of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty, the TPNW crowd, simply because I think it was still hoping and banking on becoming part of NATO, which is a nuclear armed alliance, right? And you cannot really be a supporter of the ban treaty if you benefit and from extended nuclear deterrence, right? That's against the treaty. And so Ukraine has not signed that treaty and has not really been a vocal supporter of it either.
There's a reason for that. The Budapest Memorandum taught Ukraine not to trust documents without security guarantees. They have a right to feel that way. 30 years after Kyiv signed the 1994 agreement, Russian troops are committing atrocities on Ukrainian soil.
It would be the great world where all the bad guys would have nuclear weapons and all the good guys would voluntarily disarm. And the question is, how would you suggest Russia to give up the last two of its influence, right? So, I mean, it's not really naturally looking if we look at the situation from the outside. So, summing up, coming to Ukrainian position in this regard, I would like to say that, first of all, Ukraine never participated in the debate and never voted for the TPNW, because Ukraine has shown that it's not trusting in the power of nuclear disarmament and assurances.
It's important to note that there was a time when Washington and Moscow came together to cut their nuclear arsenals. Upwards of 70,000 nuclear weapons existed in the world during the late 1980s, most of which were shared between the US and the USSR. Many scholars credit the shrewd leadership of the Reagan administration and Mikhail Gorbachev's willingness to compromise with the West that began the major cuts that got the world's total nuclear weapons count down to approximately 14,000 weapons that exist today. Former President Barack Obama came into office with a very ambitious goal of getting rid of the world's nuclear weapons. But unlike Reagan, Obama had to contend with Putin, whose goal has been to resurrect the Soviet Union he and many Russians blame Gorbachev for destroying. There's growing support for the TPNW across the global south, which makes up a lion's share of the treaty signatories. There's a pretty good reason for that. People of color have been disproportionately impacted by the negative outcomes of nuclear weapons testing, and there's no better example than the Marshall Islands, where the US conducted 67 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests between 1946 and 1958, leaving behind elevated cancer rates and ongoing displacement from contaminated areas. South Africa hosted a meeting of 37 African nations this summer to come up with ways for the entire continent to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Apartheid South Africa dismantled its nuclear program in 1989, as the country was forced to end its racist system of governments a few years later. Currently, more than 30 out of 54 African nations have signed the TPNW. Ukraine has abstained from voting on the resolution that welcomes the adoption of the TPNW since 2018. In fact, Kyiv joined its allies at the UN to protest any talks to ban nuclear weapons.
So officially, Ukraine's position remained unchanged. For the time being, Ukraine will follow its allies and especially NATO's stance on the ban. However, let me tell you how my views have changed with the war. The war showed that nuclear weapons can enable causing many deaths without being used physically when they're just used for coercion. Remember, we mentioned it before. So Russia instrumentalized fear to deter external involvement and to compel Ukrainians to give in. As a Ukrainian, I have become a supporter of irreversible disarmament for all. I think we should have, in Ukraine, should have some observer status because it would strengthen the ban movement. Because the argument that I just made about nuclear weapons being able to kill even without actually being used is a strong argument, and I think we should take it into consideration.
Ukraine won't become a NATO member anytime soon, but there have been talks about granting Kyiv security assurances along the lines of Israel in the meantime. Essentially, the US would provide continued military aid to Kyiv to fend off Russian aggression, while Ukraine works its way up to joining the alliance in the not-too-distant future. Before 2022, there was virtually no talk of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. Now it's a real possibility. More than $46 billion in US military aid alone has been sent to Ukraine, and Kyiv has been very careful to make clear they do not take the support for granted. NATO hosts 3 of the world's 9 nuclear powers. Joining that club would be the ultimate trump card Ukraine desperately wants, and they won't do anything to jeopardize that.
So this is why Ukraine has abstained from participating in the whole system of TPNW, because and also Ukraine has a very great hope to join NATO, to hide under the US nuclear and NATO nuclear umbrella from Russia, because the only thing Ukraine now believes in is nuclear umbrella.
I'm Terrell J, Starr for Black Diplomats, and this video was supported by Inkstick Media and Bombshelltoe Policy and Arts Collective.